Versailles was chosen for a reason. Gilded halls, centuries of history, a stage built for triumph. And on June the 17th, that is exactly what it delivered, an American president signing a document that ended a war. Washington had every reason to call a victory. The strikes had stopped. The Strait of Hormuz was open again. Iran, battered and isolated, had agreed to terms. By every visual measure, this was America's moment. But peel back the ceremony and the story changes. Buried inside that same agreement was a provision authorizing something far less symbolic: the resumption of legal Iranian oil sales, not smuggled, not laundered through shadow fleets and phantom shipping registries, legal. And the country positioned to benefit most from that single change wasn't sitting at the table in Versailles at all. It was Beijing. For years, China had quietly absorbed Iranian crude at a discount compensation for the risk of doing business with a sanctioned state. That risk premium was real money, real exposure, real complexity. This agreement didn't just end a war. It erased that discount and the danger that justified it in one stroke. China fired no missiles, sent no negotiators to Versailles, made no public demands. And yet when the ink dried, its position had quietly improved more than anyone else's. So the question worth asking isn't whether America won this war. It's this: did Washington just negotiate peace, or did it just do Beijing's risk management for free? To understand how that happened, we need to go back to what this agreement actually said and how fast it came together. To understand what happened at Versailles, we have to start 4 months earlier on February the 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran. The stated goals shifted as the campaign unfolded, degrading military infrastructure, curbing support for regional proxies, preventing nuclear breakout, pressuring the government in Tehran. Whatever the exact justification on a given week, the result was months of sustained conflict, missile exchanges, and mounting casualties across the region. Then in mid-June, the trajectory reversed almost overnight. On June the 14th and 15th, Washington and Tehran announced they had reached a framework agreement. 2 days later, on June the 17th, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed it at Versailles, the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, a 14-point document brokered with Pakistani and Qatari mediators. Its core provisions were straightforward on paper: an immediate and permanent end to hostilities, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, and a 60-day window to negotiate a comprehensive final agreement covering Iran's nuclear program and the future of sanctions. 5 days after the signing, the mechanics of that promise became real. On June the 22nd, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued General License X, formal authorization for the production, sale, and delivery of Iranian crude oil, petrochemical products, and petroleum products, including transactions involving vessels that had previously been blocked. Notice who didn't follow. The European Union and the United Kingdom kept their own sanctions regimes fully intact, leaving Washington to act alone on this particular front. And here's what most people miss. Nowhere in that 14-point framework was Iran required to dismantle anything irreversible. No enrichment infrastructure surrendered. No permanent verification regime locked in. Just a moratorium, a negotiating window, and immediate economic relief. That gap between what Iran gained immediately and what it was asked to give up in return is where this story really begins. But to see why China specifically was positioned to benefit from that gap, we need to go back 5 years to a partnership signed long before this war ever started. To understand why China was so well positioned when the sanctions relief arrived, we have to go back to March of 2021, when Beijing and Tehran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. At the time, it drew relatively little Western attention, a long-horizon economic framework, heavy on infrastructure and energy cooperation, light on binding military commitments. But it did something important. It formally established China as Iran's principal strategic partner at a moment when Tehran had few alternatives left. Over the following years, that partnership deepened in a very particular way. China backed Iran's entry into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It supported Iran's accession to BRICS, giving Tehran a seat at tables increasingly designed to root around Western-controlled financial systems. In 2023, Beijing went further, brokering the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a diplomatic coup that expanded Chinese influence across the Gulf without a single Chinese soldier being deployed anywhere near the region. Notice the pattern. Every one of these moves was economic, diplomatic, or institutional. none of them were military. That pattern held even when the stakes rose dramatically. When US and Israeli strikes began hitting Iranian territory in February of 2026, China did not intervene. It did not supply advanced weapons systems at scale. It did not issue the kind of sharp condemnations Russia offered. Beijing's public posture throughout 4 months of war was by design muted expressions of concern, calls for restraint, and little else. To some observers, that silence looked like hesitation, even indifference. But it reflected something more structural: China's long-standing doctrine of non-interference in the internal and regional conflicts of its partner states. This isn't a moral position so much as a strategic one. It lets Beijing build deep economic dependencies, energy contracts, infrastructure financing, trade corridors without inheriting the security liabilities that come with taking sides in someone else's war. Russia gambled with entanglement. China gambled with patience. That distinction matters enormously now, because while Washington and Tehran were negotiating a ceasefire, China wasn't negotiating anything. It didn't need to. It simply waited for the war to end on terms that would eventually restore the one thing its partnership had always been building toward: unrestricted access to Iranian energy. And that's the part worth sitting with. China's caution during this war wasn't weakness. It wasn't an absence of strategy. It was a bet that its 5 years of quiet, non-military investment in the relationship would eventually pay off once the shooting stopped. The Islamabad MOU is where that bet paid off. With this foundation in place, we can now see exactly how a peace deal negotiated 8,000 kilometers away in Versailles ended up delivering its biggest windfall to a country that wasn't even in the room. This is where everything changes, because the thing America thought it was buying and the thing it actually delivered are not the same. Start with the mechanics, because they matter more than the headline. General License X, issued by the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control on June the 22nd, authorizes transactions ordinarily incident and necessary to the production, sale, delivery, and offloading of Iranian crude oil, petrochemical products, and petroleum products. Crucially, it extends to transactions involving vessels that had previously been blocked under sanctions, a detail easy to skim past and impossible to overstate. The license runs through August the 21st, 2026, tied to the 60-day negotiating window established by the MOU itself. To understand why that matters so much to China, specifically consider what Chinese refiners had been doing for years before this license existed. Iranian oil never stopped flowing to China. It simply flowed through a shadow system. Tankers with disabled transponders, ship-to-ship transfers designed to obscure origin, rebranding as Malaysian or other non-Iranian crude by the time it reached port. All of it existed to manage one problem: the risk of triggering U.S. secondary sanctions against the refiners and financial institutions handling the trade. That risk was expensive. It's the reason Iranian crude traded at a persistent discount, sometimes significant relative to other benchmarks. Chinese buyers weren't paying less because the oil was lower quality. They were paying less because they were assuming legal exposure that legitimate buyers didn't have to carry. General License X doesn't just permit a trade that was already happening. It removes the exact risk that had been suppressing the price and complicating the logistics. The shadow fleet doesn't disappear overnight, but the reason for its existence quietly erodes. What was once a covert workaround becomes functionally ordinary commerce. Here's where the story gets more complicated and more revealing. This sanctions relief may not rest on particularly solid legal ground. The 2015 Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, ANARA, restricts a president's ability to waive statutory sanctions on Iran during a specific window following the transmittal of any nuclear-related agreement to Congress. The MOU was transmitted on June the 18th. Legal scholars have already raised the question of whether General License X, issued days later, is fully consistent with that statute. What that means in practice is this: the relief China is benefiting from right now may be sitting on contested legal footing in Washington. If that challenge succeeds, the license could be narrowed or withdrawn. But notice where the risk sits. It sits with the United States, with its own domestic legal process, its own Congress, its own courts. China bears none of it. Beijing simply buys while the argument over legality plays out entirely within America's political system. Now connect this to something less visible but equally deliberate. The Global Development Initiative, the framework China and Iran have increasingly used to describe their cooperation. For months, Iranian officials have talked about translating GDI, strategic understanding, into what they call concrete outcomes, a phrase that sounds diplomatic until you realize what it actually describes. Energy contracts, Infrastructure financing, trade volume. This MOU and the license that followed it is precisely that conversion moment. Years of hedged patient partnership building suddenly has an open channel to flow through. So hold the contrast in view. The United States secured a ceasefire, a negotiating window, and the political optics of ending a war. China secured something considerably more durable, a lower risk, lower cost, higher volume supply chain for one of its most important energy relationships achieved without a single concession, without a seat at the table, and without any of the legal exposure now sitting on Washington's desk. One side got a headline, the other got infrastructure. If that's what China quietly gained from a deal negotiated entirely by other countries, the next question is unavoidable. What does this mean for the broader balance of power, not just in the Gulf, but globally? Zoom out from the mechanics of a single license, and a larger pattern comes into focus, one that extends well beyond oil tankers and refinery contracts. Energy security has always been a form of leverage and leverage compounds. Every barrel of Iranian crude China now imports, without legal risk, strengthens a supply chain that feeds directly into its broader regional ambitions. The infrastructure financing the trade corridors, the deepening presence across the Gulf that Belt and Road partnerships have been building for over a decade. This isn't a one-time windfall, it's a foundation. And it's being poured at precisely the moment Washington is diplomatically stretched thin, consumed by the delicate work of managing a 60-day negotiating window that could collapse over unresolved questions about Iran's nuclear program and the still active conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. While America manages that fragility, China simply imports. Look at the Western side of this equation, and the asymmetry becomes even sharper. The European Union and the United Kingdom chose not to follow Washington's lead, keeping their own sanctions regimes fully intact. That decision was likely driven by caution, by unresolved concerns over Iran's nuclear trajectory, but the effect is a fractured Western position. 3 different sanctions regimes, 3 different sets of rules, no unified leverage. China faces no such fragmentation. It answers to one government, one policy, one calculation. Where the West debates, Beijing acts. There are winners and losers in this picture, and they're not the ones the Versailles signing ceremony suggested. China wins the most clearly cheaper energy, reduced legal exposure, and a strengthened regional position, all without spending a single point of diplomatic capital. Iran wins in the near term, gaining desperately needed economic breathing room after months of war. But that relief carries a longer-term cost. The more Iran's economy leans on Chinese buyers as its primary outlet, the more that relationship shifts from partnership toward dependency. The clearer losers are less visible, but no less real. American strategic leverage over Iran's economic lifelines has weakened, not strengthened. The very tool that once constrained Tehran's options has now been partially handed to a rival power. And European sanctions coherence, already fragile, has fractured further, leaving no single Western voice steering the next phase of this relationship. Here's the deeper problem. Domestically, the American public sees a war that ended. They see a signing ceremony, a ceasefire, the language of peace. What they don't see, what rarely makes it into the frame, is a supply chain quietly reallocating itself toward Beijing while the cameras were pointed elsewhere. Because the real cost of this deal isn't measured in barrels of oil. It's measured in leverage, the kind that's difficult to see disappearing in real time, and even harder to win back once it's gone. Which raises an obvious question, and one this negotiation was never built to answer permanently. What happens when that 60-day window closes? The 60-day window built into the Islamabad MOU wasn't just a negotiating deadline. It was a deadline for 4 very different futures, and it's worth examining each one because they don't all lead to the same place for China. The first scenario is entrenchment. Negotiators reach a comprehensive final agreement sanctions. Relief moves from a temporary license to a permanent framework, and the access China has gained becomes structural rather than incidental. In this outcome, General License X stops looking like an emergency measure and starts looking like the opening chapter of a durable arrangement, one where Chinese refiners no longer think in terms of risk premiums at all because the risk has been legislated away. The second scenario is messier, but still favorable to Beijing. The UNERA legal questions surrounding General License X gain traction. Congress pushes back or a court challenge succeeds, and the license faces restriction or reversal before the final agreement is complete. Even here, China doesn't lose the way Washington does. A contested legal window is still a window, and Chinese buyers moving faster than American courts have every incentive to lock in contracts and shipments, while the opportunity exists, banking the gains before any reversal takes effect. The third scenario is collapse. The unresolved issues, Iran's nuclear program, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon prove too difficult to bridge within 60 days. Talks break down, sanctions snap back into force, and the legal channel closes. Even then, China isn't returned to where it started. The shadow fleet, the discounted pricing, the ship-to-ship transfers, that playbook still exists, and Beijing can revert to it. But it now does so with months of legitimate trade relationships, updated logistics, and reinforced trust with Tehran already banked. The infrastructure of the relationship doesn't disappear just because the paperwork does. The fourth scenario shifts the frame outward. If the final agreement holds and proves durable, the European Union and the United Kingdom may eventually calculate that remaining outside the sanctions relief framework costs them more than joining it. Should Europe follow Washington's lead, the fragmented Western position that currently limits collective leverage over Iran disappears, but so does any remaining asymmetry that might have worked in America's favor. Lay these four scenarios side by side, and a pattern emerges that's worth sitting with. Entrenchment favors China. Legal stalemate still favors China on a shorter timeline. Collapse sets China back the least, because it has already banked the relationship building that sanctions relief made possible. Only full European alignment changes the picture significantly, and even then it does so by helping the West, not by costing China anything it didn't already have 4 months ago. Whichever path this takes, notice something. In almost every scenario, China loses the least. Which brings us back to the question this documentary opened with, standing in front of that signing ceremony at Versailles. Picture that signing ceremony one more time. The gilded room, the two presidents, the language of an ended war. Everything about that image was designed to say, America negotiated peace, and America came out ahead. In the most immediate sense, that's even true. The strikes stopped. The strait reopened, a fragile calm settled over a region that had spent 4 months at war. But strip away the optics, and what this deal actually did was quietly transfer leverage. Not through betrayal, not through some hidden Chinese scheme, and not because Iran outmaneuvered its negotiators. Nothing about this required conspiracy. It required only that Washington design a peace deal focused entirely on Tehran, without fully accounting for who else stood to benefit from Tehran's economic relief. A partner that had spent 5 patient years positioning itself for exactly this moment. That's the uncomfortable part of this story. It wasn't genius. It wasn't aggression. It was a blind spot, the kind that emerges when a negotiation is built to solve the problem directly in front of you without mapping the second-order consequences radiating outward from it. China didn't need to out-negotiate the United States at Versailles. It simply needed the United States to negotiate with someone else and wait. So the question this documentary leaves you with isn't really about Iran or even about China. It's about Washington's next negotiation, wherever it happens, whoever it's with. Will future agreements start accounting for the powers sitting quietly outside the room? Or will this pattern repeat one signing ceremony at a time, each one another blind spot nobody notices until the ink is already dry?